Julie, if I can just kick off with our first question. Obviously, we all know about the challenges that COVID has faced all of us. Do you think that COVID will actually enable rural Wales to change, possibly for the better this year?
Well, yes, it's an interesting question, isn't it? We've been so engaged in fighting the raging fire that COVID is really, and I mean, absolutely, the first thing to say is that your heart goes out to all the families affected by it. But if there's going to be a silver lining, then we'd certainly like to find it. And so we've been taking the opportunity alongside the firefighting to think about some of the changes that have been forced on us and some of the things that we can now do to regroup as we come, hopefully, out of the pandemic this year. And just exactly what you and I are doing right now is one of them. So I have been able to engage with a far wider range of people and organisations on a much more regular basis because we've taken advantage of the technology that's been available to us. But this time, very large numbers of us have been able to convert to online working. I mean, obviously, there's all frontline workers and so on who have had to go into work, but many of us have been able to stay in touch with family and friends this way as well. So I think that there will be real benefits to be gained from having an almost more democratic and wider participation in things where people can actually join in instead of having representatives go to things. But of course, it's brought into sharp relief some of the other issues. So we still have real issues with broadband rollout right across every part of Wales. I mean, Wales is a nation of real diversity in that sense, because we've got some of the best broadband provision in rural Wales and some of the worst broadband provision in rural Wales, and that's true of our cities too. But I think that if there's one thing that I'd like to hold on to, it's that much more democratic engagement in things that this has allowed, where people have been able to come personally to meetings and meet personally with people, if personally you mean over a screen, of course.
Sure.
And I hope there's a carbon footprint thing coming out of that as well, really.
So there are, as you say, there is a silver lining. There are going to be some benefits, and presumably, in terms of the practical perspective and the big picture, how does this all relate to the National Development Framework Future Wales? I know you're going to be publishing that document sometime over the next couple of months, which provides that overarching strategic view on where planning and the infrastructure developments will go over the next generation, presumably. I mean, where are we on that big picture sort of thinking, if I can ask you, please?
But one of the big things about it is that it was always intended for a document that would cover the next 20 years. And so obviously we've reviewed it in the light of COVID, but actually hasn't required that much review because it was always intended to be that long look at Wales. The biggest challenge that we all face, even in this year of COVID, is the climate emergency. And so, Future Wales is about fitting Wales out to face the challenges of the climate emergency. So we're actually watching the climate change in front of our eyes, and we absolutely have got to do something about it. So Future Wales is designed to make Wales resilient over the next 20 years, and it's also designed to be a living document. So that's it can be reviewed as often as is necessary, but it's meant to set out the kind of general trend of the direction of travel. But we deliberately designed it to try and look forward to the Wales we'd like to see in 20 or so years.
But what about the barriers to action? Because many of our members will talk about connecting climate change mitigation technologies such as renewable energy projects, solar panels, etc., to the grid. But even though you talked about that just now, there still are some significant barriers. So, I mean, what can Welsh Government do to really reduce those kind of barriers?
Yeah, so there's a conversation that we've been having for some time, but which will have to be stepped up with the national grid and indeed with the energy providers across Wales, because grid is a real issue in Wales, as all your members will be aware. And there's the grid connections in the south and north, which are more obvious on the map, are still inadequate to their task, really. And in mid Wales, we're really struggling. And there are real kind of equity issues there around what the grid needs to do to step up to its obligations, how much should be driven by commercial operators, farmers diversifying or indeed just running their farms, but also renewable energy projects, other big industrial projects and so on, wanting grid connection. But there is a piece for the grid to step up to by itself in terms of future proofing, which we are certainly looking to work with them, and also frankly with Ofgem, because there's an issue around the way that the pricing is at the moment, which is acting contrary to where we'd like to be in Wales. So, but part of what Future Wales is about, you'll know, is about trying to, in very broad brush terms, set out where we think the best places for various sorts of renewables are. The one everybody always concentrates on immediately is onshore wind, but actually it's not just about onshore wind. It's about solar, as you mentioned. It's about hydro. That, you know, there are whole areas of things that we can do. And also the new generation of wind is not the kind of controversial stuff we were seeing 10 years ago. It's a very different animal. And I, for one, am very interested in taking forward a project which allows all the people who are off-grid gas, so on oil and so on, you know, to connect to renewable energy.
I think you're right, and it's that mix, isn't it, of schemes. We need every bit of renewable energy generation technology we can. I mean, we're seeing some issues around hydro at the moment that we're in touch separately with Welsh Government about incentives for that. And I think the private sector is very keen to play its part, but we do need all of the barriers to be reduced, and it needs to be as easy as it is connecting more traditional fossil fuel technologies, you know, as and when you need to people's homes. We're due to launch a planning report which sets out some of the things we'd like to see change in the short and medium term. I mean, one of these relates to urgently simplifying the planning system to allow businesses to rebuild following COVID. What will Welsh Government do this year that's different? One example is something like allowing a change in permitted development rights for temporary uses of land from 28 to 56 days like they've done in England. What could Welsh Government do to really give a boost to the rural economy that we all need?
Yeah, so I'm really interested in exploring with you. It'd be interesting to see your reports when it's available. And I, you know, do please send me a copy. I'm really interested in exploring kind of templates where we say, well, look, if you make it look like this and it's out of renewable, sustainable material, locally sourced and blah, and you know, whatever, then actually it's permitted development. So I'm not, I will say, keen on just saying, yeah, you know what, build whatever you like, because, you know, it's more important to build it than, because actually a large part of our industry, you know, not just the farming and producing bit, but the tourism industry in particular, comes for the beauty. And so we have to do some stuff to make sure that that beauty is preserved whilst allowing people to have a sustainable business. So I think there's a medium way to be found there with people who are, you know, always reasonable and who love the land as much as the rest of us do. So I think there is a way forward for that.
Farmers have been encouraged for many years to diversify by Welsh Government, but many of our members, this is their words, believe that planning is a major hindrance to this. What would you say to a typical farmer in Wales, you know, wondering what the future holds for his or her business, but appears to be blocked at every single turn?
So I think the first thing is to have a relationship with the local planning department. So the local planning departments are funded by the Welsh Government to have pre-planning conversations with people and actually trying to work through with them what is likely to be, you know, problematic and what isn't. It is a good thing. We have identified ourselves a number of barriers that we're not happy about. So we have, you know, blanket rules in place for some things which need to be a bit more nuanced, shall we say, for different areas, and we're happy to look at that as well. I have a lot of sympathy for local authorities who have, you know, gone through 10 years or more of austerity and who have stripped back their basic functions to the bone, and planning has been one of the ones that's really suffered from that. So your members may not be aware that we've just put an act through the Senedd which forms regional structures to put the regional strategic plans in place. And part of the reason that we've done it the way we have is because we want to put some more money into the system to allow more experienced planners with better careers to be able to come up through the authorities to the regional level and to be able to share the expertise around Wales. And then, as I say, we're really interested in looking at developing kind of templates. So instead of having to start from scratch each time, you'll know that there are a series of things that your local planning authority is likely to think are okay in your area. So if you're in a national park, for example, if you build it out of these materials and it looks like this and so on, it's much more likely to be an acceptable thing. So to de-risk it for people who are applying, because it can be both costly to get and very large numbers of people feel the need to employ somebody to help them, which obviously increases the cost as well. So we're trying to de-risk it for people and also to assist the local authorities to be more imaginative and innovative, but still holding this balance. Always the balance is the thing that's important, isn't it? So the sustainable development, allowing the industries, your farming, the agricultural industries to flourish, but at the same time preserving, the natural beauty of the landscape.
We speak to a number of members that live in particularly beautiful parts of Wales in the national parks, and what they're finding is that yes, they're offered pre-planning advice, but then when they actually go to submit the planning application, they're having to produce many more reports, which is very expensive, and then the application is turned down at the end. So I guess our question really is there possibly a better way of trying to approve or indeed not approve planning applications that doesn't result in this enormous amount of work up front, which is very disheartening, often doesn't work?
Yeah, so again, what we're very keen on doing is supporting the various local authorities to have the expertise to assist people in the first place. But actually, the planning authority can very proactively put strategic plans in place for particular areas, which are much more directive in terms of what can happen there. And then you get this sort of template development that I'm talking about. So that if you did this, this, or this, it would be fine. And the other thing to say, and I always say this when I talk to all of the stakeholders in planning, there's always a pressure, isn't there, between the central government and the local government here. So it's really important to keep the decisions local. And they're made by local councillors who are elected. So it is about, making sure you influence the policies at the right place. And the other frustration, and I know you're aware of this, is that these things are all contained in local development plans and so on. It's just human nature, isn't it? That there's lots of opportunity to engage with those plans as they go through, and many areas of Wales are actually doing the review of the plans right now. But unfortunately, people tend not to engage at that level. They only engage at the point where they want a particular planning thing to go through, or they don't want a particular planning thing to go through. And by then, often there are strategic policies in place which go against what they're trying to do. So I do encourage people to get involved in the planning process as early as possible. And then the other thing is I make the offer that if you're aware of a systematic problem, as opposed to individual planning applications having a problem, then I'm more than happy to have a look at that. So if you've got 5 to 10 applications encountering the same difficulty in a local authority, then I'm more than happy to have a look at that and see if we can do something about it.
I mean, do you see there's a bright and rosy future for our national parks and our AONBs in these areas of fantastic landscape where we can combine sustainability with creating jobs and growth?
Oh, very definitely. And it is about an attitude to it, isn't it? So, it's about the kinds of industries we built and the type of housing we build, for example. We haven't got onto housing, but that's often a very emotive subject across Wales. So, we need to build a lot more housing that's affordable for people. Social housing in particular is in short supply. And I just want to set this out because I think it's worth saying, so bear with me. So often we found that when you're trying to talk about putting social housing into place, it has a stigma attached to it. So people don't want it. They feel it'll, I don't know, affect the property prices or whatever. But when you go slightly beyond that and you actually interview people in more depth, often it's because the housing is not accessible to them. Because it's so rare at the moment that we have a whole series of systems that ration it effectively. So you have to be in quite dire need to get to the top of the housing queue. If we built enough housing, which is about 20,000 houses over the next 5-year Senedd term, for social rent, that's not a wide range of housing, that's just for social rent, and we put those all over Wales in small groups of 5 or 10 in lots of villages, then a lot of the youngsters who grew up in those villages will suddenly have houses that they could access and stay in the village. So, but if we built a small group of housing in the village I live in that children who grew up in this village could access, then you'd keep the village alive. It wouldn't turn into a dead tourist village. And that's essential, isn't it, across Wales? And the same goes for farm diversification. If you need a house for a worker or a child who wants to stay on the land with you, then we'd like to help you do that. What we don't want is for people to do that and then sell them on the open market. But we could help build housing where there's a public equity stake in that housing. So it stays affordable and available for rent for local people. And we actually get rid of a large number of the housing crisis, and we stop the drain to the cities that we have as people look for affordable housing. And the other thing, of course, is to get the utilities right. So, to get people on grid and to get the right broadband and all that kind of stuff. That's absolutely essential for modern living. So there's a piece of work we can do around that helps the farmers, make the sort of development they want, but also keeps Wales the way that we'd all like it to be.
One of the key benefits that will come out of COVID, putting aside the awful parts of it, is that with more home working and more flexible working, people will be able to have good, well-paid jobs and run successful business in the rural areas, won't they? Which means you can afford the market rates. So I think you're absolutely right. I mean, Minister, just one more quick question on housing, if I can. Do you think we've got a better policy in Wales than we have in England, because we work across the border and we see many developers on cross-border counties such as Powys moving to England because it's just too challenging to do anything in Wales?
I'm told that it's too challenging in Wales by a large number of the bigger house builders for some time, Nigel, but if you analyse our figures, they all still build here. It's something I'm afraid I think they just say. So one of the big scandals earlier on was there was a big fuss about the fact that we wanted to put sprinklers into all new build, and there was a huge fuss about how that would increase the cost and people wouldn't build here and so on. Actually, they're still building here. And after the Grenville tragedy, people have suddenly converted to the idea that we should have sprinklers in new build buildings. So it's a shame it took a tragedy to make that clear, but I think we were right to insist on those sprinklers. Similarly, we've just talked about climate change. We insist on high insulation, carbon neutral or carbon passive housing for our social housing, and I am in the process of making sure that we can do that for all housing that's new build in Wales. We simply cannot afford to build houses that leach heat into the landscape and are built with completely unsustainable materials and supply chains. We can create a timber-based industry, which virtually every landowner in Wales will be able to contribute to if they start to grow the right kind of trees. And you'll know that we have policies that are coming into play to help that. We can have small locally based factories across Wales that employ local people in them in good jobs. These are excellent jobs inside, that build the kind of housing that we need for the future, that have almost zero construction waste and don't require enormous landfill sites if you do knock them down to get rid of the waste that they generate. What's not to like? If you're building a small development somewhere in Wales, you build it to these standards, then we will enable the local council and the local registered social landlords to buy those off template for you. So they will help with your cash flow.
I think many of our members would be delighted to work with you around the whole forestry and timber issue. We know we need to plant an enormous number of trees compared to what we're doing at the moment. And I think one of the things that's always concerned our members is that unless there's a market at the end of the tree's life, they're less inclined to do it. Minister, I'm sure you'll be pleased to know it's my last question. You obviously know as well as anybody, there's a Senate election this year. Can I just ask you, when we reach that point, what would you look back on with most pride, and what would you like to see the next government do post-May 2021?
The thing I'm most proud of is actually come out of COVID, and that's Wales' treatment of homelessness. So I am really proud that Wales has done that. And the other thing, which is a flip side of the same coin, I'm really proud of our record on free school meals. So I'm really proud that we've done that as well.
Our time is up. Julie James, Minister for Housing and Local Government, thank you very much for your time, and we'll be in touch with you in due course. Thank you very much.
Real pleasure, Nigel. Nice to see you.